For those of you that are already on, thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to wait another minute for people to log in. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the Department of Labor's recent rule on climate and other ESG considerations in retirement plans. This session will be recorded and shared after the event. You're welcome to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to follow up as possible. Thank you to those of you who have submitted questions when registering. We have integrated several of those into our conversation today. Ceres is committed to equity, diversity, and a just and inclusive economy. We're pleased to convene this group of knowledgeable and committed experts and public servants to share their insight, but acknowledge that the panel composition does not fully reflect our goal to address systemic barriers that persist in the workplace and the world at large. As we continue to make change, we recognize how to do and be better. Next slide, please. As many of you know, Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit working to transform the practices and policies that govern U.S. and global capital markets to reduce the worst financial impacts of climate change and other sustainability threats. For over 30 years, we've worked with some of the largest investors and companies on their own sustainability plans, state and federal policies, and regulatory issues. Next slide, please. We present this webinar to you today together with the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the world's leading international nonprofit organizations. EDF creates transformational solutions to the most serious environmental problems. To do so, EDF links science, economics, law, and innovative private sector partnerships. With more than 3 million members, EDF is working to turn its solutions into action. Next slide, please. Today, we will hear from Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, Assistant Secretary Lisa Gomez, including a brief Q&A with the Assistant Secretary before proceeding to a panel discussion moderated by EDF's Stephanie Jones with leaders from Legal in General, the AFL-CIO, and the American Retirement Association. We are waiting for the Secretary to log on, and so we're going to start the next portion of our session with Assistant Secretary for the Employee Benefits Group at the Department of Labor, Lisa Gomez. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks very much, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. As you know, on November 22nd of last year, we here at EPSA issued a final rule on prudence and loyalty in selecting investments and exercising shareholder rights. This rule amended 29 CFR section 2550.404A1 of ERISA, which is a regulation that applies ERISA's duties of prudence and loyalty to investment decisions and the exercise of shareholder rights, including proxy voting. by fiduciaries of ERISA plans. These amendments were adopted after EBSA published a notice of proposed rulemaking in October of 2021, which was preceded by a review of 2 final rules that were adopted in late 2020 by the prior administration. I want to just start today by saying that my discussion today is to give an overview of the final rule, which in large part became effective on January 30th of 2023. I do need to note, however, that on January 26, 2023, 25 states and some additional plaintiffs filed secretary against the secretary and the department, claiming that the final rule violates the Administrative Procedure Act and ERISA and should not be enforced. And because of that pending litigation, there are restrictions on what I can say today and what I may be able to say in response to questions later in today's webinar. So I appreciate everyone's understanding with respect to that. So let me just start with talking a little bit about why the department felt the need for the amendments to the 2020 rules. The 2020 rules stated as their purpose was to clarify the extent to which environmental, social, and governance factors could be used by fiduciaries when they were selecting investments and exercising shareholder rights, including proxy voting. The department found that responses to the 2020 rules were showing that they may have inadvertently caused more confusion than clarity that fiduciaries were looking for in this area. And the stakeholders that the department heard from stated that the 2020 rules had what we refer to as chilling effects that were contrary to the interests of participants and beneficiaries with respect to consideration of ESG factors. And specifically, we heard from stakeholders that the 2020 rules were discouraging the use of ESG factors, even where consideration would be in the plan's economic interest to use those factors. And ERISA plans were therefore on the sidelines, not taking actions that other investors routinely take to improve performance and enhance their portfolio's resilience to the effects of risks that are associated with climate change and other ESG types of matters, and we're missing out on opportunities. And with that little intro, I will hand it over to Secretary Walsh, who has joined us, and we're happy to have him today.
Mr. Secretary, before you, I just want to just give you a brief introduction. First, thank you for joining. Thank you for all you're doing. Stephen Rothstein from Ceres, more importantly from Boston, from your perspective. But just for the audience, I don't know of anybody who literally has done more, first as a state representative, then as a mayor, now as secretary, both for working people across the country and thinking about climate issues both together. And so really, Mr. Secretary, thank you for all you're doing and thanks for joining. Turning it over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And it's great to see you. And I want to thank you, Lisa, for filibustering a little bit for me. I want to thank everyone. I was at a 30th anniversary, Lisa might have already said this, but of the FMLA, of its passage and where we are in America for workers and things like that. So I apologize. I sit in the front row and there was Congresswoman DeLauro was there, Congresswoman Underwood was there, a whole bunch of other people, and I didn't want to leave. So anyway, here I am. Thank you all for joining us today. I just want to thank Lisa and the team at EBSA for the hard work they've done on this important issue. You know, as all of you know, one of the Department of Labor's primary objectives is to make sure that retirement savings of American workers is safeguarded. And I also want to thank anyone from EBSA that's on here. I met a lot of people last week here at the Department of Labor. But amongst other things, that means having to make sure fiduciary plans can manage and can prioritize financial interests of people who are saving, who are the savings they're stewards of. There's a lot riding on investment choices. It's the goal of secure and dignified retirement. It's the ability to make sure your savings last and preserve lifestyle that you worked hard to achieve. And it's also the freedom of being a burden on your family. And that's why plan participants have and their beneficiaries have the right to expect that fiduciary will inform and have the information and knowledge they have available to make the best possible choices about investments. And that's what the law requires. We're here talking about it because the last administration put in place a rule that effectively prevented that from happening. In 2020, regulations discouraged fiduciaries from looking at relevant information about environmental, social, and governance factors that were making investment choices. But it's well established that ESG factors can impact investments. So if investors can take these factors into account, it's a problem. If they can't take it into account, it's a problem. And that's why addressing the issues has been a priority of this administration, of the president, of the vice president, and here at the Department of Labor. In May of 2021, President Biden issued an executive order on climate-related financial risk. The order directed the Department of Labor to decide if a new rule was needed to make clear investment retirement plan investors could look at ESG factors. We engaged and we listened to all stakeholders about their experience with ESG factors. Certainly, we listened to investment managers, corporate America, labor organizations, consumer groups, service providers, investment advisors, and workers. The broad consensus of people told us that we should revisit the rulemaking because it's a new approach that we needed. In November, we released the final rule that came out of this process, and last week it went into effect. The rule recognizes the impacts of ESG factors on retirement investments. It reflects what smart and careful investors already know and allows plans to take ESG factors into account when appropriate. Just to be completely clear here, federal law continues to demand that these investment decisions are based solely on the best financial interest of the plan participants and beneficiaries. The new rule helps clarify how these duties apply to choosing investments and exercising shareholders' rights. The decisions made by plan investors must be based on factors relevant to investment risk and return, and those factors may include ESG factors. Our priority and our commitment remains to protect and support the retirement security of America's workers. That's something that's really important. This administration has shown that from day one. And the simple truth is that those who are entrusted with all these savings must make the smartest and most prudent decisions on how to invest them. The rulemaking makes sure that federal policies allow this to happen, and it's an important step towards making sure a more secure fiscal future for America's workers and their families. And certainly it's something that it's near and dear to my heart. As Steve said, I've spent a lot of time in my career, whether it was as a state representative or as a labor leader or a mayor of the city of Boston, to have those responsibilities put on me, like many of you. So I just want to thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone at EPSA for the amazing work. I want to give Ali a shout out as well, who's done some great work in the space. And Steve, thank you. Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the leadership. We appreciate your time. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Eric to moderate a discussion or further comments with Lisa. Eric?
I think we can return to Lisa. I think she probably had some more to say about the rule. Thank you. And thank you, Secretary Walsh.
I appreciate it. And yes, thank you, Secretary Walsh, for your leadership on these and so many other issues. So as the Secretary went into a little bit of how we got here, we did hear from many stakeholders in response to the proposed rulemaking that was issued in early 2021. The department received about 900 written comments and over 20,000 petitions during the comment period. And many of the people who commented confirmed to the department that the 2020 rules had deterred fiduciaries and were continuing to deter fiduciaries from taking steps that other marketplace investors would be taking to enhance the investment performance of retirement assets or to improve the resilience of their investment portfolios against potential financial risks and impacts that would be associated with ESG factors, including climate change, but not limited to climate change. So the final rule, which was issued in November, does a few things that we'll explain a little bit more. First, it makes clear that fiduciaries can, but are not required to, consider the economic effects of climate change and other environmental, social, and governance factors in retirement plan investing. I think it's important to note that this is something that can be done, but it's not a per se requirement to do so. Second, the rule takes the thumb off of retirement plan managers in making investment decisions, so as to level the playing field, as the webinar is aptly named, with respect to consideration of these types of factors. The rule also permits the use of the tiebreaker test if there are competing investments that equally serve the interests of the plan. It makes clear that the fiduciary duty includes exercising shareholder rights, including proxy voting. And it continues to make it clear the basic concept of ERISA, that fiduciaries cannot sacrifice financial returns in order to promote ancillary goals. The risk return analysis is just of primary focus and concern for fiduciaries, and the final rule does not change that in any way. Just to get into a little bit of the details of the rule keeps the core principle, as I said, that the duties of prudence and loyalty, which are basic fiduciary 101 duties, requires that plan fiduciaries focus on the relevant risk return factors, and that they not subordinate the participants and beneficiaries' financial benefits and security in their retirement plans, such as by sacrificing returns or taking on additional risk to take advantage of objectives that are unrelated to those benefits. The final rule keeps the longstanding principle that the fiduciary duty to manage plan assets that are shares of stock includes the management of ancillary shareholder rights with respect to those shares, like the right to vote proxies. The final rule followed the proposed rulemaking and removed the 2020 rules, quote unquote, pecuniary and non-pecuniary terminology. And the reason why we did that was in response to concerns that terminology caused confusion and, again, a chilling effect to fiduciaries considering what could be financially beneficial choices. The 2020 final rules had introduced that pecuniary only framework to focus fiduciaries completely on financial factors when making investment decisions. But that term pecuniary is not in ERISA and has no longstanding place in employee benefits law. Rather, the final rule amends those 2020 rules to make it clear that fiduciary's determination with respect to investments has to be based on factors that the fiduciary reasonably determines are relevant to the risk and return analysis, and that such factors may include the economic effects of climate change and other ESG factors on the investment. And whether or not an ESG factor is going to be relevant to a risk return analysis really depends on the facts and circumstances. The final rule also hit a few other areas. Like the proposed rulemaking, the final rule amends the 2020 rules to remove the stricter rules that had been put on qualified default investment alternatives, or QDIAs. Under the final rule, the same standards apply to QDIAs as apply to investments generally. So there's nothing special from an ESG standpoint with respect to a QDIA as opposed to any other investment. The final rule also amends the 2020 rules tiebreaker test that was included in that rule. That test in the 2020 rules allowed fiduciaries to consider collateral benefits to break a tie between competing investments only if the fiduciaries were unable to distinguish the investments based on pecuniary factors alone. The final rule changes that standard to one that permits the fiduciary to break a tie if the fiduciary prudently concludes that the competing investments equally serve the financial interests of the plan over the appropriate time horizon. Again, the consideration of the impact on the risk return analysis remains paramount, but the removal of the pecuniary factors alone gives the fiduciary a little bit more flexibility in determining what's best for the plan participants. The final rule also has a provision that states that fiduciaries do not violate their duty of loyalty if they take participant preferences into account when they're putting together their menu of prudent investment options in a participant-directed individual account plan. And the department's view was that if accommodating the preferences of participants would lead to more people participating in their individual account plans, higher deferral rates into those plans, as commenters suggested that they would, then there could be greater retirement security if more people are putting more money away for retirement. There was also removal in the final rule of a provision in the 2020 rules that had said that the fiduciary duty to manage shareholder rights related to shares of stock does not require the voting of every proxy or the exercise of every shareholder rights. That was removed from the final rule, and the stakeholders and commenters that we heard from agreed with our concern that that language in the 2020 rules could be misinterpreted to suggest that plan fiduciaries should be indifferent to the exercise of their rights as shareholders. So that was taken out of the final rule. The final rule also makes some changes with respect to the removal of two safe harbor examples that were included in the 2020 rules for proxy voting policies. The department felt that those safe harbors encouraged abstention as the normal course with respect to those types of investment actions, which is not in line with the importance of prudent management of shareholder rights in valuing plan assets and protecting plan assets from risk. The final rule also eliminated a provision in the 2020 rules that set out certain specific monitoring obligations with respect to the use of investment managers and proxy voting firms. And the final rule instead addresses those monitoring obligations in a way that just more generally covers a fiduciary's obligations with respect to selection and monitoring without a specific obligation that would apply solely to ESG factors. The final rule also eliminated a provision in the 2020 rules that imposed a specific requirement on maintaining records on proxy voting activities and other exercises of shareholder rights. It was widely perceived that that provision treated proxy voting and other exercises of shareholder rights different from other fiduciary activities. And so the final rule changes that. I guess I'll just close out by saying that this rule is really just a common, based on a common sense, basic concept of ERISA, that fiduciaries are required to act prudently and for the exclusive purpose of participants and beneficiaries in everything they do, including making investment decisions and proxy voting. We considered this rule to be a return to neutrality, and based on, basic principles of ERISA. And the intent of the rule is to level the playing field so that planned fiduciaries can consider these ESG factors in investing in the same way that they would consider any factors that would be relevant to a risk and return analysis. And as I said, the rule became effective last week, and we are working towards efforts to continue to implement the rule and educate the public, the participant community and the plan community about the rule. And I appreciate the opportunity today to work towards doing that.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Gomez, for those thorough and helpful remarks. And I imagine that much of what I want to ask you about, you've touched on in one form or another in those remarks, but perhaps helpful to reiterate certain points and to go into some more depth. So I wanted to start by saying our read of the final rule is that it is quite neutral, allowing fiduciaries to consider climate or other sustainability risks when they're financially relevant, but not encouraging or requiring them to do so any more or less than they would with other factors. Major corporate law firms have the same view, but much of what has been written in the public sphere gives a different impression. Are there misconceptions about the rule that you would like to highlight any further?
Yes, thanks, Eric. I will just say that a couple of things. One is that I think your characterization of the rule, as you stated, is spot on. And there are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about the rule and what it says. And I'm hopeful that the department and our partners in the plan sponsor community and the investment community can assist in making sure that people understand what the rule in fact says, what it does, what it doesn't do, and people can disagree about how they feel about the rule, but if we can at least be on the same page as to what it actually provides for, that'll be a step in the right direction. As I said, the rule does not per se require consideration of these factors. It does not force people into choosing certain types of investments, and it most definitely does not allow fiduciaries to sacrifice risk and return in favor of consideration of these factors. So hopefully people can learn more about the rule and get on the same page about it.
Well, thanks so much for helping us today to do just that. And can you speak to, for those that may not be ERISA experts, what types of retirement plans does this apply to? And do you see this rule as potentially having a broader impact on the retirement industry, even outside the plans that it directly governs?
Sure. So the duties of loyalty and prudence that I referred to apply to all ERISA plans. So they would apply to not only individual account plans like 401k plans, not only participant-directed plans where participants are choosing which investments they would invest their retirement savings in, but all plans, including defined benefit plans, including retirement plans where the sponsor chooses the investment itself. So all retirement plans are covered by this. I think as far as the impact on the retirement industry, As the secretary said, and as I alluded to in my comments, we're hopeful that through this rule, workers will have a better shot at greater retirement security through better investment or broader investment opportunities, which were discouraged by the last administration's rule that was stricter with respect to ESG factors. So that could be an impact. We're just hopeful that this rule means that people won't have missed opportunities in order to increase their investment performance or be precluded from, taking steps that can protect their savings from financial risk.
Thanks so much. I know you mentioned QDIAs, but can you talk a little bit about the importance of them? They're commonly known as the default fund, and how does the rule affect those funds?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, QDIAs are important and important for fiduciaries to focus on, because if you have a participant directed individual account plan and a participant does not choose where they would like to have their retirement savings invested, then they will be invested in the QDIA fund. That being said, the final rule removes any stricter rules for QDIAs than would normally apply. So if a fiduciary, in deciding what the QDIA fund will be, decides that it is in line with the fiduciary's duties of loyalty and prudence to consider ESG factors in deciding whether or not to use a specific fund as a QDIA, then it can do that, and just as it would in the normal course with choosing any other type of investment. But of course, participants have the right to choose other investments. They're not forced into the QDIA. They're not forced to stay in a QDIA, and so the QDIA is just put on the same, in the same category as any other investment with respect to ESG factors.
Great, thank you. Another slightly more detailed question, or specific, but if a plan were to consider adding a climate-aligned large cap equities fund, for example, what types of alternatives should be considered in determining whether that fund would be prudent to add to the lineup? Would it need to be compared to the entire universe of other large cap equity funds, whether or not they were climate aligned, or would it only be compared to other large cap ESG equities funds?
So with respect to that question, there's not special treatment for an ESG type of fund. The fiduciary would need to just look generally at the risk return analysis in investing in a certain type of fund, and would look at other types of funds in that same category, like the large cap equity fund, as you would describe. I think that this is an area where we may be hearing more on, and it's something that we are working on, making sure that that folks have education on that. But I think the basic thing is to focus on the risk and return analysis generally, and not to consider an investment in a very specific type of category, and limiting it to ESG types of funds when you're making that comparison.
Yeah, that makes sense, and thank you so much. I could keep asking you questions. I've got lots more, and it's fascinating to hear answers, but I think we have to yield to some of the other activities on our panel today. I do want to thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Gomez, and thanks also to the Secretary, Marty Walsh, for your leadership thanks also to the entire EBSA staff. I know how much work went into putting out the proposal, reviewing all those comments, and then getting a final rule done. And we really appreciate the leadership and the direction that you pointed us in on this. So thanks so much for your participation today and for everything you've done.
Thank you. And thanks for saying that. I would be remiss in not acknowledging the very intense work that was done by the department prior to me coming on in October. It was exciting to have such a large project come to fruition in the early days of my tenure here, but there were certainly, a great team here that worked very hard on putting this rule out, and I appreciate all of them, and I appreciate all of the stakeholders who gave input that led us to this final rule. But thank you.
Great. Well, thanks again. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague from EDF. Stephanie Jones is going to introduce a panel of industry participants and experts in this topic and talk them through a number of questions for them. So thank you to Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thanks to Secretary Walsh and Secretary Gomez for their time today and for their work to restore this longstanding regulatory framework under ERISA to protect workers' retirement savings. My name is Stephanie Jones, and I'm an attorney at Environmental Defense Fund, where my work focuses on the serious and growing financial risks that climate change poses. I'm thrilled to be facilitating today's panel discussion about these important standards. So let me quickly introduce the distinguished labor and business leaders who are joining us as panelists today, and then we'll hear from them. So first, Allison Wheelabob. Allison is General Counsel at the American Retirement Association. She has worked on a broad range of retirement security issues, both in government and private practice, including at the Labor Department's Employee Benefit Security Administration. Second, Brandon Reese. Brandon is the Deputy Director of Corporations and Capital Markets for the AFL-CIO, a federation of labor unions that represent 12.5 million workers. Brandon also serves as Supervisory Committee Chair of the AFL-CIO Employees Federal Credit Union and as the trustee of the AFL-CIO Staff Retirement Plan. And finally, John Hefner. John is the head of U.S. Stewardship and Sustainable Investments at Legal and General Investment Management America and the U.S. representative of the firm's corporate governance team. John is responsible for shaping the firm's corporate engagements and driving demand for sustainable investing strategies in the U.S. market. So we have a really great depth of expertise and range of perspectives represented today on this panel. So to start off, I'd like to invite each of you to share 1 to 2 minutes on just your overall perspective on this rule, the most important things from your perspective that you'd like our audience to know. So let's start with Allison.
Thanks. And I just want to say thank you to Ceres for inviting the American Retirement Association to participate today. ARA appreciates, first of all, the department's willingness to recognize some of the concerns we raised with the proposed rule, and we're pleased with where the rule comes out, and it makes clear that ESG factors may be considered if the fiduciary determines them to be relevant as part of a principles-based fiduciary analysis. So it leaves it up to the fiduciary, as I believe ERISA intended. I would also say that for me personally, not speaking for ARA, some of the misinformation coming out of non-governmental, some of I have found to be rather inflammatory and certainly misrepresenting, I think, where this rule has landed, and I think it's landed in a good place. And so I think the Labor Department's not in the business of public relations, but unfortunately, I think that we're going to have to spend some time remediating some of the misinformation that's been put out there. And indeed, this is the Labor Department has been issuing guidance on this issue for decades, and this is the most neutral place that they have landed in all of those decades. And I foresee that, to my mind, it should work well for plan participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Brandon, your initial thoughts?
Oh, thanks, Stephanie. And I want to add my thanks to Secretary Walsh and Assistant Secretary Gomez for all your work on this rule. The AFL-CIO supports this new rule, which we believe will strengthen the retirement security of working people. It provides retirement plan fiduciaries with the legal certainty for when they're considering environmental, social, and governance factors in their investment decisions. And we believe that when ESG factors are relevant investment considerations that can affect risk-adjusted returns, fiduciaries should be permitted to consider those factors. I look forward to today's conversation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Brandon. John?
Thanks, Stephanie. Real quick, at a high level, we at Elgin were very supportive of the recent ruling. We submitted our public support via the comment process. And I can also reinforce what both Ms. Gomez and Mr. Walsh said, that at a practitioner level, there was and continues to be confusion about integrating ESG considerations. In fact, it's the #1 most cited reason when we speak with our own clients and prospects about integrating ESG, particularly into the 401k context, but in the broader ERISA context. At a slightly more deeper level, I think one thing I think a lot about is this going to unleash a wave of ESG assets in the retirement community? I think the answer is no in the short term. We feel that, particularly those politically motivated folks will dig their heels in, and I think it's going to be a slow slog. But what's going to be interesting is for those fiduciaries that likely believe that ESG is a reasonable material consideration, they are going to start more incrementally adding ESG options into their lineup. Particularly of interest, I just float out there, which we can get into later. I think it's be very interesting to see how this impacts indices. As we know, indexes have been a huge uptake in the ERISA market. And when you add ESG consideration in an index context, it's very intentional. So I think that's going to be a real interesting debate. So we're happy to dive in deeper.
Thanks, John. And I think each of you have already touched on this a bit, but just to directly address from any of you, if you'd like to elaborate, in your view, why is it important for retirement plan managers to have discretion to consider climate risk and other ESG factors? And how does this rule support that discretion?
I would characterize it, if I may, as I don't think the federal government should have its finger on the scale one way or the other here. And I think that until now, there was what we're seeing is the thumb has been lifted, and now fiduciaries are free to consider, I think, what institutional investors already know. I mean, this is ESG factors are material risk return factors. And now plan fiduciaries are free to act to incorporate those and use their discretion as the statute envisions. I would say to opponents of the regulation, or those that are critical, that they need to go back to the statute, or if they want significant change, they're going to have to change the statute.
Yeah, Steph, if I could follow up, under ERISA, retirement plan fiduciaries are bound by what is known as the prudent expert rule. That requires fiduciaries to exercise the same level of care, diligence, prudence, and skill that an expert familiar with such matters would do. And today, that means considering environmental, social, and governance issues, just like you might consider traditional financial information, such as earnings or the balance sheet of a company. And also today, tens of trillions of dollars in assets under management are expressly making use of ESG factors for their investment decision-making. And when we're talking about the retirement savings of working people through pension and defined contribution plans, these ESG factors are particularly relevant because they're long-term investors that are investing over the expected lifespans of their participants. So that's why this rule is so important. It levels the playing field to acknowledge what has become a widely followed best practice in asset management, which is to consider ESG factors.
I think they captured it well, Stephanie.
Yeah, well said.
So that leads right into my next question, which was that despite the mainstream acceptance we've seen in the investment community that climate risk and other ESG factors can affect investment risk and return and therefore should be considered. We've seen some pushback from various quarters on this rule and on ESG more generally. Are there any misconceptions that any of you have seen about ESG or about this rule that you'd like to help clear up?
Sure, maybe I'll jump first on that one. And it's an important and it's a good question. So first, I do think that ESG as a catch-all concept is a poor description, right? Everyone in the industry recognizes that ESG is a bad acronym. We like to think of it as context information. And so if you replace that idea with just, do you want context information about your investments? It's a lot easier to have a really good, high quality discussion with someone if it helps to include context data. It's definitely gotten politicized. And so that is the big misconception, is actually the definition of ESG and kind of the misdefinition of it. We think the best way to really move the debate forward is to analyze very practical risk return considerations of, having a stable workforce, or understanding flood risks, or really isolating real crisp risk and return examples. And that helps move the conversation forward. So I think that's one of the big conclusions we have.
I want to chime in and say I 100% agree with the labeling issue. I think that, we talk here at ARA internally about, I don't know, other terms you see around values-driven investing. Maybe that would be better. For some reason, the E really gets under people's skin and in this context. And I think that if we could really educate people and explain, well, if you really want to get any sort of collateral considerations away, there are things called Ave Maria funds, for example, out there where for a very long time, they're sort of religiously affiliated organizations will restrict a fund's investments to investments that correspond to their values. Under a strict interpretation of what some of the opponents of ESG investing are saying, those would be out as well. I think that some of the voices out there are unfortunately blinded when they see the letter E, and that's where the misinformation cascade begins.
If I could just add, the Department of Labor's final rule wisely did not attempt to identify a specific list of ESG factors. And that's important because investment practices evolve over time. Since ERISA was first passed in 1974, the Department of Labor has instead focused its regulatory activities on ensuring that pension plans are managed according to a prudent process. And it is not sought to regulate which particular investment strategies or investments are made by fiduciaries. And this approach makes sense because investment practices evolve over time, as do our capital markets. And what are relevant ESG factors for investors to consider is going to evolve over time. And that's why removing the final rule's prohibition on ESG funds as the default investment alternative for defined contributions is so important. It eliminates uncertainty that was created by the previous administration's prohibition of these ESG funds without actually defining them. And we believe that the best investment for a qualified default investment alternative should be the best fund that's selected, regardless of how or whether it considers ESG factors.
I'm going to add one thing. It's sort of related to what Brandon said, somewhat indirectly. And a question came up during Lisa Gomez's presentation where someone asked about what is the durability of this new regulation. And this is the prior administration's final rule was the first time that the ESG under prudent investing, that this concept had been memorialized in a federal regulation. Until then, going back to the 70s, it was only an advisory sub-regulatory guidance coming out of the Labor Department, and it sort of gradually went up the steps of being more and more durable. The regulation subject to notice and comment rulemaking, as was the prior administration's rule, and this rule is the most that an agency can do in order to make it more permanent. Now, as we saw with, say, the fiduciary rule, and with this rule replaces another rule. But it had to go through this long process of notice and comment rulemaking. And, you know, the fiduciary rule was vacated. I guess a court could do that with this one, but this is about as much as the Labor Department can do to make it permanent.
Thank you all. And Allison, if I could just ask you a follow-up question. You had referenced before some changes that were made between the proposed version of this rule and then the final version that was ultimately adopted. Just for anyone who's not closely familiar with those changes yet, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on those changes and why you see them as important.
Yeah, so I think above the biggest one is that the headline item is that, you know, that the regulation acknowledges that consideration of ESG factors may be part of satisfying the fiduciary duty of prudence, and it doesn't sort of set them apart. It doesn't make, you don't have to justify looking at them. It just sort of says that this is where we are. They are part of a material analysis. The other thing, big rules, significant change to my mind is simplification of the tiebreaker rule, and also in order to even to make it easier to use ESG or other collateral benefits as a tiebreaker between competing investments. Previously, the fiduciary had to conclude that two investments could not be distinguished from one another. They had to be, the reg said, indistinguishable. At that point, a fiduciary could permissively consider ESG factors or other collateral benefits. And that is a concept, I think, that scared a lot of investment managers away. And maybe John could talk to that. But now it's a equally serve the financial interests of the plan over the appropriate time horizon. That's the standard. If you get two investments and that's where the fiduciary comes out, then they can explicitly look at other factors, things like ESG. And also the QDIA thing, which you mentioned, Stephanie, that's huge. And that's one of the things that the ARA was very interested in changing from the prior rule, because we know what auto enrollment and auto investment selection does for retirement participation rates. And so we were very happy to see that.
Thank you, Allison. So I think we're already getting towards the end of our time for this panel. So I just want to pose a final question and get about a minute of each of your thoughts on it. So now that we have this DOL rule in place, what additional steps do you see as most important in the market to increase availability and uptake of climate aligned or other ESG retirement options? Or is there anything that those in our audience can do to help move the ball forward on that? Whoever would like to go first.
Sure, I can jump in, particularly from the investment manager perspective. The number one thing that we are doing, and I would say all of our peers, is being laser focused on the precise investment objective of new strategies we offer and the investment process, and making sure the marketing materials are really clear. Once we do that, the existing fiduciary process takes over and people will make a decision if that's the right fit for their plan. But that is really, really important, because there has been lazy or blurring historical language where is the investment objective to try to, make the environment slightly better, or is the investment objective purely in the long-term interest of the financial? And there of course are places where it overlaps, but that little laziness has caused this huge, partly to blame on this backlash. So that's one thing I want to just put out there, is that's what the asset management community is doing, and I think you're going to see really great strides forward.
Well, I'll go and I'll be brief since I've taken up a lot of the oxygen. I feel like I would say the ERISA lawyer in me is going to go back to specific requirements, which is something like plan fiduciaries should consider reviewing their plan's investment policy statements and see what sort of parameters they have, and if need be, make adjustments.
Yeah, I would just add that it's going to take time for pension plan fiduciaries to learn about the new rule and to make any changes. Plan fiduciaries are inherently cautious by nature, And so any changes that we see will be gradual. What I think was the biggest news was that consideration of the interest of plan participants in the selection of the QDIA is the biggest change, and that the rule makes a compelling case that the appropriate consideration of plan participants' views can encourage defined contribution plan participants to contribute more savings to their retirement plan. That's a good thing that will help secure the retirement security of working people. And so I'm excited to see this new rule move forward, and we look forward to implementing it at the pension plan level.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your great insights today. We're so appreciative of your time and your expertise. And I will turn it back to Eric to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks to all the panelists. Really excellent job illuminating the key issues and helping us all understand better the impact of this rule. So I'd like to kind of put the ball in the court of all the participants in the session today with a call to action. Here are the things that we think you can do to help move the state of play forward in the retirement industry. So if you are a corporate leader or have direct responsibility for your company's retirement plan, do you currently offer options that account for climate risk? If not, where are you in your investigation of these options? If your plan does include climate-aligned investment alternatives, have you provided a range of such options in different asset classes, and have you evaluated climate-aligned life cycle funds? If you are an employee participant in a 401k or 403b plan, review the options available in your plan. Are there climate-aligned or other ESG options? If not, ask your manager or HR representative, have these options been investigated, and what could be the next steps to add them? You may also wish to raise this topic with your colleagues. There are well-organized groups of employees at many large companies pushing for these changes in their 401k plans. And all of you can call or email your elected representatives to let them know that you want them to support this rule because it helps protect your retirement savings from climate and other ESG-related financial risks. Next slide. Please help us improve our sessions by providing feedback with this QR code. We'll leave it up for a moment so you can use your cameras to grab it and give us some feedback. And we'll also be including the QR code in the follow-up email that you'll receive after the session. Next slide. Ceres Global is our annual conference bringing together leaders from the corporate, investment, and public interest sectors to discuss challenges and solutions for creating a more just and inclusive zero emissions economy. If you're not already registered, early bird prices end Wednesday. Register now to join us in New York in March. Next slide. Finally, please be in touch if you want to learn more or engage us in this work. We're eager to support those pushing for these changes at their organizations. A link to Ceres' Sustainable Retirement page, along with my email address, can be found on this slide. I want to give a final thanks to all of our speakers and panelists and all the folks working behind the scenes to make this event come off. But most of all, thanks to all of you, our participants, for joining us today. Have a great evening.